bad that I've given absolutely everybody else an intro, but I cannot find your bio. But here's what I know about you. You're pretty amazing. You're really smart, and you're very, very good at identifying national priorities in space. Uh, I'm going to post your book here in a second. I'll find it in a moment. But I apologize. Can you just introduce yourself a little bit more than that? Because you're more than what I just said.
Sure, Michael, and thank you for having me here. Can you hear me all right?
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I am basically an independent scholar working on space policy. I look at the space programs of the US, China, India, Russia to an extent, and as well as middle powers like Luxembourg. Recently, I co-authored a book called Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space with Peter Garretson. And as part of my research, I also have conducted fieldwork in both China and India. And in 2019, I testified before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's space program. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to the Lunar Development Conference hosted by the Moon Society. It comes at a very relevant time because, as you would see from my presentation, the moon is becoming a critical focus of not just the US, but for like countries like China, India, Russia, Japan, as well as UAE, and recently Turkey. Turkey's announced a program to go to the moon by 2023. Let me share my slides. So, see my screen? All right, great. So in the half an hour that I have, what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the cislunar pivot, as well as some of the future missions that are in store for the next 10 to 15 years. And so what is interesting, especially from the perspective of why are we going to space in the 21st century? Roger mentioned this as to why should the US population or the electorate support more funding for space? So one of the articulation that actually has a lot of traction in another country, China, is that the Earth-Moon system, especially the mapping that you have here, including their relay satellite that is at L2, Bao Weiming, who is one of the chief architects and the spokesperson for the China National Space Administration and the Academy of Sciences, basically points out that the return of investment on the lunar surface, including resources and in situ resource utilization, is going to be about $10 trillion by 2050 annually. So for China, the reason why they are actually investing in a lunar exploration and utilization program is not just for the sake of science or exploration, but also because they have identified the very real economic benefits that come from it. And so there's a very clear reason why the state, especially under President Xi Jinping, is investing in a lunar capacity. So if you look at why the moon has suddenly become so critical, especially in the last 5-10 years, we've always known that there is solar energy that can be used. For example, in the peaks of eternal light, there is eternal light. There is oxygen in the moon that can be used not just for life sustainability, but also for rocket fuel. Water, which was discovered for the first time on the Chandrayaan-1, which was India's first mission to the moon through a NASA mineralogy mapper. There is also the possibility of helium-3. And in fact, the reason why some of the scientists from India and China are talking about a lunar exploration program is the possibility of finding helium-3, because in their estimation, that is critical for nuclear fusion. Then there are rare earth elements. For example, there could be iron, there could be platinum, especially titanium, that is possible on the moon as well. But there are also some non-tangible benefits of why the moon is becoming so critical in the space policy focus of countries like China, Russia, Japan, and India. And that is, first of all, it's very proximate. So it's not far away. In fact, if you listen to the recent rationalization of the China-Russia Memorandum of Understanding, their argument is that if you do not sustain yourself on the moon, it is not going to be possible to become a spacefaring civilization. That's the planetary body that's nearest to us. And so their argument is that once you sustain yourself there, only then can you think of further probes into deeper space. The moon has very less gravity. And for example, The next chart will tell you why they are interested in looking at the moon, especially in terms of a lunar base, is because it's not just about, again, exploration. It's also because the gravity well of the moon is much lower than the gravity well of Earth. The struggle that our rockets go through to actually escape Earth's gravity requires 22 times more energy than if you actually construct in situ rockets on the moon and then send probes deeper into space without using much fuel. So there is a very clear articulation of why the moon has become critical in the estimation and thinking of countries besides the US. Now, some of the lead players in terms of the moon is, of course, the US, especially with the recent announcement of the Artemis Accords, where we have about 9 countries that have signed in, including Brazil very recently. So there is that. The second country, of course, is China Lunar Exploration Program, which was established in 2002. So we are actually about 20 years into that particular program. So the one thing I always remind my audience is that it seems like China is achieving a lot very quickly. But actually, if you look at China's lunar space program, especially their exploration program, it's been in the making for the last 20 years. So all the deadlines that you are seeing being achieved, including their lunar far side landing, the Chang'e 4, for example, their lunar sample return, these missions were actually conceived about 2002 and then was executed by 2007 once they got the funding. But what is uniquely different in China's articulation is, of course, from the very beginning, China's space scientists recognize the why. So they explain the why, that is in terms of lunar resources and economic returns, actually in our interviews that were given in 2002 itself. Now you have Russia, which also has a lunar program, and as many of our speakers have mentioned, have recently signed an MOU. I'll talk a bit about that in the next slides as well. India also has a very experienced lunar program. In fact, India tried to land on the very close to the lunar South Pole in 2019, but failed in the last few seconds. And then, of course, you have Japan with a lunar exploration program and also with very clear-cut ambitions and missions that have been set for the next 2 years. Now, China's focus on the moon, very quickly, it establishes the moon as an Earth-Moon economic zone by 2050. China became the second nation in the world to plant a flag on the moon, a fabric flag. In fact, the Global Times, which is one of the propaganda outlets for the Communist Party of China, very jingoistically stated that the 21st century is the age of Chang'e. The 20th century was the age of Apollo. And so the first flag of the 21st century has been planted by China on the moon. So very nationalistic discourse in terms of why China is going to the moon. Now, this is what they are planning to do in the next, in the next 20 years. The missions that you see in blue are the missions that have already been executed. So in 2020, as we all know, they autonomously brought back lunar samples back to Earth. And then by 2024, they're aiming at bringing samples from the South Pole. 2030, a survey of the South Pole for evaluation, especially its composition. And then by 2035, test key technologies like 3D printing to lay groundwork for the construction of their base. And of course, the first research base on the moon in collaboration with Russia by 2036. So another interesting aspect of China's conversation around the moon is that they equate it to the concept of territoriality. So Ye Peijing, who is the head of China's lunar mission, stated that the moon is very similar to some of the islands in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And so if we do not lay some kind of claim by way of presence, we will be actually questioned by our descendants. And this kind of logic was supported by Ouyang Jiang, who is their chief designer. And he pointed out that China's long-term aim and task is to set up a base on the moon. And this was in 2002. So they have been actually planning in establishing this base for a very long time. And then again, you can see the development and utilization of the lunar potential mineral and energy resources stated by Luang Angji, who is the former director of the China National Space Administration. Now, some of the treaties that I thought I should mention before I document a bit the other countries and their missions to the moon. As we know, the Outer Space Treaty, of course, limits the placement of any kinds of weapons of mass destruction. The one condition that the Outer Space Treaty lays is, of course, that you cannot have national appropriation of any real estate on any planetary body. But what it also says is that you can have utilization and use. So the conversation coming out of China, Russia, India is that can that utilization be done without actually claiming territory? And the argument seems to be that it can be done. But there are conflict triggers because first of all, the moon is a very small body. And also there are only certain areas on the moon that have resources, for example, the South Pole, and that could lead to some kind of conflict in the future once bases are established, and if China and Russia establishes a zone of non-interference, which Chinese strategic culture thinks about. The Moon Agreement, of course, again, is another agreement that determines the geopolitics of the moon. It has not been signed by the major spacefaring nations, but about 18 nations have signed it. One of the biggest concern on the Moon Agreement was because of the argument that once developed nations function and develop capacity for extraction, this has to be shared with developing countries, even those countries that have not actually invested any resources. And that was one of the main reasons why the Moon Agreement was not signed by the US, China. India is a signatory, but has not ratified it. Now, today, of course, the biggest lunar politics is between China, Russia, and the Artemis Accord. So when the Artemis Accords were actually put out by the former NASA administrator under the former Trump administration, the biggest opposition to the Artemis Accord came from Russia. Russia argued that this is about US trying to take leadership and actually establishing a kind of colony. China was much more silent in terms of their opposition, but China was active, actually, much more than Russia in doing something tangible as an alternate alignment system by actually proposing a memorandum of understanding with Russia. But because, as was mentioned in the panel, China today has the resources to actually invest in a long-term lunar development capacity, and Russia actually has joined in as a junior partner. So just quickly, before I get into a bit more detail about the different nations investing in lunar development, we of course have the Google Lunar X Prize, which I believe is a catalyst for almost all the development that we see today. We have Hakuta, the parent company iSpace, which has announced a launch to the moon by 2022. You have Team Indus, which was an Indian company that was supposed to also launch, was one of the finalists, but of course, the ability to fund for their launch fell out with the Antrix Corporation, which is the Indian Space Research Organization's commercial fund. They had to pay about 20 million, but could not get the funds for it. Today, Team Indus, of course, was part of Orbit Beyond, but then fell out of a contract with NASA. Space IL has announced that they would try again in terms of another moonshot by 2024 with the Bereshit 2 moon mission. I was looking at the website of Synergy Moon. They seem to want to have collaboration in terms of international efforts to go to the moon by 2022, this time to stay. And then you have Moon Express, which actually is now competing to become a part of the commercial lunar payload services program. So what is interesting is that almost all the 5 finalists are actually continuing their presence in one way or other. The most viable, of course, seems to be iSpace, with a very clear-cut program of going to the moon. So now let's get to the actual, what are we looking forward in terms of the future? So if you look at the timelines that I have put here, so between 2017 and 2024, we of course have the Artemis program, which is a US government funded program and based on international partnerships to go back to the moon with the landing of the first woman and the next man. You have China's lunar exploration program that aims to establish a lunar base by 2036. You have the Japanese Lunar Exploration Program, which is a program based on robotic and human missions between 2007 and 2030. And then you have Lunar Globe, which is a Russian moon exploration program that is timed between 2021 and 2040. Now, by 2022, these are the missions that we can hope to see in terms of their ability to actually meet their deadlines. We have the Chandrayaan-3 from India Space Research Organization, which will be a repeat of the Chandrayaan-2, but will also include a lander and a rover similar to the Chandrayaan-2, but it will not have an orbiter. As we know, an orbiter is already around the moon because of the Chandrayaan-2 mission. You have some private companies that are wanting to go to the moon by 2022. You have Nova C2, which is a which is a lunar lander designed by Intuitive Machines, and which wants to deliver a small commercial payload. I do know that Maston is developing the XL1 small cargo lunar lander, but their deadline has shifted from 2022 as I speak to 2023. So they have shifted it a year back. You have this is a mission to watch. You have the Hakuta R mission 1 by iSpace, which will include a lunar lander and will try to soft land on the moon. So they might actually become the first private company if they succeed to land on the lunar on the lunar near side. Now in 2023, there are some major programs that are going to happen. We have Fleet Space Technologies Lunar Exploration Mission. You have NASA's Viper exploration rover. Then you have Hakuta R Mission 2 by iSpace and Draper Lab, which will include a lunar lander and a rover. You also have Blue Ghost, which is a lunar lander designed by Firefly, which is aiming to go to the moon by 2023. And then you have the Dear Moon Project, which is a lunar tourism mission. And we all know about that, which has made the news very, very much with Japanese billionaire Maezawa. By 2024, one of the missions that is going to have geopolitical significance is, of course, China's Chang'e 6, which is going to be a robotic Chinese lunar exploration mission to actually perform the first reconnaissance mission for their International Lunar Research Station with the aim to bring samples from the lunar South Pole. You have Rashid, the UAE's first lunar rover, which will include high-resolution cameras, and it's going to be launched on iSpace's space platform. So you can see collaboration between UAE and Japan. You also have Blue Moon by Blue Origin, which is a robotic space cargo carrier, which had aimed to be able to go to the moon by 2024. And then you have Roscosmos, Luna 26, which is a lunar polar orbiter, which plans to function as a telecom relay between the Earth and Russian landed assets. So between 2025 and 2027, again, you have several major Russian lunar probes. You have the Luna 27 with collaboration. And this is interesting because the Luna 27, which I don't think gets reflected in our conversation, is actually a collaboration with the European Space Agency to go to the moon between Russia and Europe. So they're planning to go to the South Pole Aitken Basin by 2025. You have Luna 28 again in 2027, which is again another mission that plans to go to the South Pole with the objectives of a sample return to support the Chinese mission a year earlier. Now, between 2028 and 2030, you again have several missions, but again, the mission to watch, I would say, are the joint Russian-Chinese missions. So China's Chang'e 7 will be an orbiter, rover, lander, and hopper to make detailed surveys of the South Pole region, covering the terrain, geological composition, and location of polar water ice. So I think that's one of the missions that is going to be utilized for the establishment of the Lunar Research Station. Now, in the last few minutes that I have, I'll say that one of the interesting insights that I got last month in June was when the China National Space Administration released their detailed roadmap of how they are going to actually create this international collaboration with countries, especially along the Belt and Road Initiative. So you can see these are the maps that they have put out in their detailed analysis of how they're going to go about. So they're actually starting the construction by 2031. So you can see that this planning has been happening for several years now. So by 2030, they'll finish the survey of the moon's South Pole. And then by 2031, they'll actually start the construction of the International Lunar Research Station. And they hope to complete it by 2035. And these are some of their concept designs of how the International Lunar Research Station would look like. And if you see their launch platforms, by 2035, they will have their heavy lift rocket, which is the Long March 9, which is capable of taking 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit. And the aim is to have 10 heavy lift rockets in 1 year. So they are actually having several missions planned by 2035. And so before I end, I would say that there are several reasons why all these countries are looking at the moon. Basically, some of the missions are about investigating the origin and history of what the moon is. For example, Leonard Davis made an interesting point that we don't have that particular data as yet. So you have the Japanese Space Agency that is actually investing in looking at that kind of understanding of the moon. You have NASA's Lunar Crater Radio Telescope, which will of course be there in terms of astronomy, and the European Space Agency that is taking steps to understand how to extract resources like oxygen and water on the moon. Now, the Earth-Moon future, as I see it from my analysis of China, Russia, Japan, India, is that the basic priority is to actually establish permanent presence on the moon and to be able to sustain human presence. So some of the developments we can see by 2035 is that there will be helium-3 that will be extracted from the lunar regolith. We could have lunar mining, but what I see from the mapping of China especially, which is the most serious space lunar program, is that this will be based on autonomous capacity. And they are basically investing in that capacity and becoming leaders in artificial intelligence and robotics. And we would see moon ports in terms of their articulation. And so one of the connected technology, which I thought I should bring to the conversation, is that if you listen to China's articulation of their lunar exploration program, they're also developing a simultaneous technology that they think will benefit their lunar base, which is space-based solar power. So one of the designs which the China National Space Administration has developed is, of course, the design on the left. And this is what they plan to do. So they are hoping to actually be able to process a megawatt level space solar power station by 2050. We also have very small experiments in the US. The Air Force Research Laboratory has an experiment going on as we speak, and the US Naval Research Laboratory has an experiment in space trying to understand power beaming. So these are very interesting times in terms of looking at space, not just from a prestige reputation perspective, but actually from the perspective of the economic returns. Now, this is the present that you're looking at. This is not the Cold War. This is not just two space powers having space programs that are actually dominating the world. I thought I would create this map so that you get a sense of what has happened since then. It's unbelievable if you look at this map, how many space agencies have been established. And the recent, of course, as I mentioned, is the Turkish Space Agency that has announced a program for the moon. And you can see that Africa is starting to become very, very serious in terms of collaborating with China, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative to go to the moon, if possible. And I think it will be because the China-Russia International Lunar Research Station is calling out for partners in terms of creating that alignment structure. I'll finally end with this. So one of the important points in terms of looking at the lunar development is that we sometimes forget that the technology development is not the end goal. So if you look at China's articulation of why they are investing in the moon and why they are actually talking about cislunar space, it is located within the ideological perspective of President Xi, who wants to establish China as a lead actor in space. And one of the books which I found very insightful was The China Dream by Lu Mingfu, a retired colonel from the People's Liberation Army, who pointed out that the ability to persuade or coerce countries to behave in a manner that is beneficial to the country, yielding space power, is important. And that is why China should actually invest in an independent launch capacity, project and maintain military space power, and enable access to key zones in space, to include the moon and the Lagrange points. And this particular book actually influenced some of the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force leaders, like President Yang Zhuling, who pointed out in 2016 that China's focus is the Earth-Moon zone. And as Joss was mentioning, it's very critical that China's understanding of space warfare or war in general is that you actually win without fighting. So you develop your economic prospects and you establish yourself as a lead player without actually breaking down into war. And finally, I'll end by saying that this is what President Xi pointed out in terms of China's space dream. So he said, experience tells us that great undertakings begin with dreams, and dreams are the source of vitality. China is a nation that pursues dreams bravely. The Communist Party of China's Central Committee's decision to implement the Lunar Exploration Project is to pursue the nation's unyielding dream of flying into the sky and reaching for the moon in the journey of building a great modern socialist country and realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And what is insightful is that space is now included in terms of the China dream and is part of the civil military fusion strategy. Michael, I think I'll end there and look forward to any questions.
Terrific, fascinating. So many things I want to talk about right now. First of all, I wanted to say thanks. Those are amazing slides. Like the effort you put into putting those slides together is very nice. So, uh, I actually was when you started this presentation, I was watching to count how many missions, but then I got caught up in the details as you were describing them. So I didn't actually count how many missions, but it feels like it's a lot of missions to the moon. Did you count them? Do you know what the number is?
Well, from the top of my head, if you look at China's missions, there are about 12 missions
12.
till about 2036. But then they are now collaborating with Russia, which also has about 10, 12 missions. So that itself makes it about 22 missions. And then you have the missions from Japan every year from iSpace. So that is about 4 missions. And so I would say that if you count India's missions and UAE's rover, I think it's about 30 missions from the top of my head. And
That,
that's yeah, and that's just in the next 5, 6 years. So
yeah.
we are not even talking about the distant future,
No, right, right.
right? Yeah, so it's quite a lot.
I mean, to go from uh, Dr. Lanius to Dr. Goswami, right, where we had two nations, two budgets, and one goal, right, the moon, versus I don't know how many space agencies you showed on that one screen, but half a dozen or a dozen lunar missions. I don't know how many budgets that means. I don't know how many companies or organizations involved, but it is really quite astounding to see that evolution. So thank you for showing us that kind of depth and width. uh, it's a new world right now. Like we're in a new space.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, I would like to reiterate that it's not just, so there is a misunderstanding that just because we are talking about space, it's all about wonderful cooperation. That is what we aspire for and we hope for. But if you look at the programs, for example, China and Russia space program, Turkey, for example, India to an extent as well, these are very nationalistic space programs.
Yeah.
And so China, what it has very cleverly done is that it has actually established a Belt and Road Space Information Corridor in the last few years. And this is President Xi's thinking in terms of institutionalizing the Communist Party of China. So Xi learned a lesson from Hu Jintao and Deng Xiaoping that if you want to have the Communist Party of China as a central body in terms of decision making, you must have it institutionalized, including in foreign policy. So the Belt and Road Initiative, including space and the Lunar Development Program, has got credibility today because China has demonstrated capability. It's not like they're just saying things, they're actually executing those goals and meeting those goals, including their first landing on Mars this year, right? Which was a big achievement for them.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
that does is that it attracts partners. So for example, Turkey, Saudi Arabia is now talking about collaborating with China. France recently said that they are actually thinking about collaborating with China and Russia in terms of their lunar program. The first conversations I hear. So you have an alignment structure here that's vying for partnership with regard to the moon.
Roger was talking about glory, God, and gold. It definitely feels like there's a lot of glory to be had. I think that's why India attempted their mission, Israel attempted their mission. it's time. It's time for other nations to start developing their own lunar systems for their own glory. It's amazing. It's an amazing time right now. Thank you, Dr. Goswami. We're going to move on. Really appreciate your time here and your insight.